The red dust of Kepler 442b swirled around Dr. Lisa Martinez as she knelt beside the strange crystal formation her team had discovered 3 days ago. The alien structure jutted from the ground like a massive tooth, its surface smooth and dark with veins of silver light that pulsed in patterns she had never seen before. Her breath fogged inside her helmet as she carefully brushed away centuries of accumulated sediment with tools that seemed almost primitive compared to the technology before her. Lisa had been studying alien artifacts for 12 years, ever since humanity had first made contact with the Galactic Council. She had examined ruins on 17 different worlds, cataloged thousands of strange devices, and learned to read the writing systems of 6 extinct civilizations. But this crystal was different. Every scanner they pointed at it gave readings that made no sense. The material registered as both organic and synthetic, ancient beyond measure yet somehow still active. Her assistant, Dr. Ben Carter, approached with the portable analysis unit they had brought from their ship. Ben was young, maybe 28, with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded Lisa why she had fallen in love with xenoarchaeology in the first place. He had joined her expedition 6 months ago, fresh from the Galactic University, where he had studied under some of the most respected alien scholars in known space. "The deep scans are complete," Ben said, his voice crackling through the comm system. "The crystal extends at least 50 meters underground. The energy readings are off the charts, but they're not dangerous. It's almost like the whole thing is waiting for something." Lisa stood and looked at the towering structure. The silver veins pulsed more rapidly now, as if responding to their presence. She had seen reactive alien technology before, but this felt different, more aware, more purposeful. The local star was setting behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the excavation site. They would need to make camp soon, but something told her they were close to a breakthrough. "Have you tried the standard activation protocols?" she asked Ben. "Not yet. I wanted to wait for your approval. Some of the energy patterns remind me of the Veiltar ruins we studied in Professor Williams's class. But those artifacts were millions of years older than anything we've found with active systems." Lisa nodded. The Veiltar were one of the great mysteries of galactic archaeology. They had left behind massive structures on dozens of worlds, all apparently abandoned simultaneously about 3 million years ago. No one knew what had happened to them or why they had vanished so completely. Their technology was far beyond anything the current Galactic Council possessed, yet they had simply disappeared without a trace. She activated her scanner and pointed it at the crystal. The device immediately began recording energy signatures, mineral compositions, and structural analysis. The crystal responded by brightening, its silver veins now pulsing in perfect synchronization with her scanner's sweep pattern. Ben stepped back nervously, but Lisa felt a strange sense of anticipation rather than fear. "It's definitely Veiltar," she said after examining the readings. "The energy signature matches samples from the ruins on Altair 7, but this is intact. This is active. Ben, we might be looking at the first functioning Veiltar artifact ever discovered." The implications hit both of them immediately. A working Veiltar device could revolutionize their understanding of the galaxy's history. It could provide answers to questions that had puzzled scientists for generations. Why had such an advanced civilization vanished? What had they been trying to achieve? What secrets had they left behind? Lisa made her decision. She adjusted her scanner to the activation frequency they used for most alien artifacts. It was a standard procedure, designed to safely interface with unknown technology without triggering defensive systems or causing damage. She had used it hundreds of times before on dozens of different worlds. The crystal's response was immediate and overwhelming. The silver veins blazed with light that penetrated even their protective visors. Energy coursed through the structure like lightning, and the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with a deep, resonant hum. Ben grabbed Lisa's arm as the crystal split open along invisible seams, revealing a hollow interior filled with swirling patterns of light. Then the hologram appeared. It was a figure unlike anything in the known galaxy, tall and graceful with features that seemed to shift and change as they watched. The being's voice spoke directly into their minds, bypassing their ears entirely. The words came in perfect English, though Lisa somehow knew they were being translated from something far older and more complex. "Greetings, children of the Third World," the figure said. "I am Keeper Vexithani of the Veiltar Collective. If you are receiving this message, then the time of prophecy has begun. The species we have long awaited has finally reached the stars. Lisa and Ben stood frozen as the holographic being continued speaking. The message was clearly ancient, recorded long before humans had even developed agriculture. Yet it spoke of them with startling accuracy. The keeper described a species that would emerge from a small blue world orbiting a yellow star, a species that would challenge everything the galaxy thought it knew about civilization and progress. "We have watched the patterns of galactic development for millions of years," the keeper explained. "We have seen species rise and fall, empires expand and collapse, wisdom gained and lost. But we have seen only one species that truly frightens us, not because of their weapons or their technology, but because of something far more dangerous, their hope." The hologram gestured, and star charts appeared around them showing the familiar outline of Earth's solar system. Lisa's heart raced as she realized they were looking at a map created millions of years before humans had even discovered fire, yet it identified their homeworld with perfect precision. "These beings will refuse to accept limitations that others consider natural law," the keeper continued. "They will befriend their enemies, spare their captors, and sacrifice themselves for strangers. They will see potential where others see only fixed patterns. They will inspire change in species that have remained unchanged for millennia. They are the catalyst that will either elevate the galaxy to unprecedented heights or tear apart the foundations of civilization itself." Ben's hand tightened on Lisa's arm as the implications sank in. This was not just an archaeological discovery. This was a warning that had been waiting for humanity to find it, a message from an extinct civilization that had somehow predicted their arrival among the stars. The keeper's image began to fade, but its final words echoed clearly in their minds. "The choice that destroyed us now falls to those who come after. Choose wisely, children of persistence. The galaxy's future rests in your stubborn, beautiful, terrifying hands." The crystal went dark, leaving Lisa and Ben standing in the gathering darkness of an alien world, forever changed by the weight of an ancient prophecy that named humanity as the galaxy's greatest hope and greatest threat. The emergency session of the BM Galactic Council convened within 18 hours of receiving Dr. Martinez's transmission from Kepler 442b. Ambassador Zethkri of the Altarian Empire stood at the center of the vast circular chamber, his forearms gesturing dramatically as he addressed the assembled representatives of 12 different species. The translation devices hummed softly as his words converted into dozens of languages simultaneously. "We cannot ignore what has been discovered," Zethkri declared, his voice carrying the weight of genuine fear. "The Veiltar were the most advanced civilization this galaxy has ever known. If they left a warning about the humans, we must take it seriously." Captain Alex Rodriguez sat in the human delegation section, feeling the weight of hundreds of alien eyes upon him. He had served as Earth's primary representative to the Council for 3 years, and in that time he had grown accustomed to being the outsider, the newcomer whose species had only recently been granted observer status, but today felt different. Today he was not just representing humanity's interests, he was defending their right to exist. The Zenthari delegate, a tall being with crystalline skin that reflected the chamber's lights in rainbow patterns, spoke next. "The prophecy describes humans with disturbing accuracy, their unpredictable behavior patterns, their refusal to accept established social hierarchies, their tendency to form emotional attachments across species lines. These traits make them dangerous to galactic stability." Alex felt his jaw tighten, but he remained silent. The Council's rules required all members to speak before any responses were allowed. He watched as one by one, the alien representatives voiced their concerns about humanity's presence in galactic civilization. The Corvan Empire's representative, General Thakmor, stood with his massive frame casting shadows across the chamber floor. The Corvan were a warrior species, but even they seemed unsettled by the prophecy's implications. "Humans do not fight as we understand fighting," he growled. "They make allies of their enemies. They show mercy to those who would destroy them. This is not strength, it is madness that spreads like a disease." The Mindari delegate remained seated, as was their custom, but her thoughts projected clearly into the minds of all present. The telepathic species rarely spoke aloud, preferring to communicate through direct mental contact. "We have observed human mental patterns during diplomatic meetings," her thoughts conveyed. "They form genuine emotional connections with beings they have just met. Their thoughts lack the proper barriers that separate civilized minds. They feel empathy for strangers as if they were family members, Alex listened as speaker after speaker described human traits that they viewed as dangerous aberrations, their capacity for hope in hopeless situations, their refusal to accept that some problems had no solutions, their habit of treating former enemies as potential friends, their tendency to question authority even when that authority was benevolent and wise. The Cytherian representative, an ancient being whose species had been part of the council for over 8,000 years, spoke last among the established members. The Veiltar prophecy warns of a species that will disrupt the natural order of galactic civilization. For 10 millennia, we have maintained peace through careful balance, through respect for established hierarchies, through acceptance of each species' place in the greater whole. Humans respect none of these principles. Finally, it was Alex's turn to speak. He stood slowly, aware that his words might determine humanity's future relationship with the galaxy. The chamber fell silent as he walked to the center speaking platform, his boots echoing in the vast space. "You speak of our differences as if they are diseases," Alex began, his voice steady despite the pressure he felt. "You describe our hope as madness, our compassion as weakness, our refusal to accept limitations as dangerous instability. But I ask you this, what has your stability achieved?" The alien delegates shifted uncomfortably as Alex continued. "For 10,000 years you have maintained peace by ensuring that nothing ever changes. You have prevented war by preventing growth. You have achieved harmony by accepting that some species will always rule while others will always serve. You call this civilization, but the Veiltar called it stagnation." Alex activated his portable display unit, projecting images of human achievements since joining the galactic community. In 3 years, humans have introduced new medical techniques that have saved millions of lives across 7 different species. We have developed new agricultural methods that have ended food shortages on 12 worlds. We have created artistic collaborations that have produced works of beauty that your own critics call unprecedented. The Altarian ambassador interrupted. "And you have also caused 3 different diplomatic incidents, sparked labor unrest on 5 worlds, and inspired 2 separate independence movements among client species. Your very presence creates instability." "You call it instability," Alex replied. "We call it growth. You see the Corvin workers demanding better conditions as a threat to order. We see it as beings discovering their own worth. You view the Xanthari youth questioning their rigid caste system as dangerous rebellion. We see it as young minds refusing to accept that their potential should be limited by the circumstances of their birth." He paused, looking around the chamber at faces that ranged from curious to hostile. "The Veiltar prophecy doesn't describe us as destroyers. It describes us as catalysts. We don't tear down civilizations. We help them become more than they thought possible. Sometimes that process is uncomfortable. Sometimes it challenges beliefs that have remained unchanged for millennia. But the alternative is what happened to the Veiltar themselves." The chamber erupted in confused murmurs. The Veiltar were considered the pinnacle of galactic achievement, the greatest civilization in known history. The idea that they had somehow failed was almost incomprehensible to most council members. "The Veiltar achieved perfect stability," Alex continued. "They created a society so advanced, so perfectly ordered that nothing ever changed. And when the galaxy around them began to evolve, when new challenges arose that required adaptation and growth, they couldn't respond. They were too perfect, too stable, too afraid of disrupting their own harmony. So they died. Not in war or catastrophe, but in quiet stagnation." He gestured toward the empty seats that had once belonged to extinct species, civilizations that had risen and fallen during the Council's 10,000-year history. How many others have followed the same path? How many species have achieved stability only to discover that a universe that never stops changing has no place for things that never grow? The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. The youngest member of the council, a representative of the Nalari whose species had only joined 50 years ago, stood to speak. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "the question is not whether humans are dangerous to our civilization. Perhaps the question is whether our civilization is worth preserving, if it cannot survive the presence of hope." Professor Amy Watson spent 17 sleepless hours analyzing every piece of historical data the galactic archives contained about extinct civilizations. Her office at the University of New Geneva was littered with empty coffee cups and scattered papers as she worked through patterns that had taken her years to notice. The Veiltar prophecy had sparked something in her mind, a connection between seemingly unrelated historical events that painted a disturbing picture of galactic history. She pulled up the records of the Kethmori Empire, a civilization that had controlled 47 star systems before vanishing 800,000 years ago. According to official histories, they had been destroyed by internal revolution, their rigid social structure collapsing when lower castes refused to accept their assigned roles. Amy compared their timeline with astronomical data and found something interesting. The revolution had begun shortly after first contact with a species called the Wanderers, beings who traveled between stars without permanent homes and seemed to view all individuals as equals regardless of their origins. Amy moved to the next extinct civilization on her list. The Velquan hegemony had ruled 600 worlds before fragmenting into dozens of smaller nations 300,000 years ago. The official records blamed economic pressures and resource disputes, but Amy found references to strange ideas that had spread through their population like wildfire. Ideas about individual rights, about the value of personal choice, about the possibility that their strict hierarchical system might not be the only way to organize society. These ideas had appeared after contact with a mysterious species that Velquan records described only as the question askers. The pattern became clearer with each civilization Amy examined. The Threndai Collective, the Morgeth Empire, the Stellar Kingdom of Vilex, all of them had been stable, advanced societies that had suddenly collapsed or transformed beyond recognition. All of them had made contact with species that their records described in terms that made Amy's skin crawl with recognition, the ones who refuse their place. The species that sees no barriers, the wanderers who make friends of strangers. Dr. Ben Carter knocked on her office door, just as Amy was pulling up the oldest records in the archives. He looked as tired as she felt, his usually neat appearance disheveled from his own research into the Veiltar prophecy. They had maintained constant communication since his return from Kepler 442b, sharing data and theories as they tried to understand what they had discovered. "Amy, you need to see this," Ben said, activating his portable display. "I've been analyzing the linguistic patterns in the Veiltar message. The phrase they used to describe humans, children of persistence, appears in 17 different extinct languages, always in the context of warnings or prophecies." Amy felt her heart rate increase as she compared Ben's linguistic data with her historical research. The species that had caused these great disruptions throughout galactic history were always described in similar terms. Beings who refused to accept limitations, who formed bonds across species barriers, who saw potential where others saw only fixed reality. Every description matched the Veiltar prophecy's characterization of humanity with terrifying accuracy. "Ben, I think the Veiltar prophecy isn't about humans specifically," Amy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's about a type of species that appears in the galaxy periodically. A catalyst species that disrupts established civilizations simply by existing among them." She pulled up a galactic map showing the distribution of extinct civilizations over the past 2 million years. The pattern was unmistakable once she knew what to look for. Waves of transformation had swept across the galaxy, always starting from first contact with mysterious species that seemed to embody the same traits the Veiltar had identified in humans. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, Captain Alex Rodriguez was discovering that the Galactic Council's fear of humanity went deeper than anyone had realized. His investigation into recent human-alien interactions had started as a way to defend his species' reputation, but what he found made him question everything he thought he knew about galactic politics. On Corvin Prime, a human mining crew led by foreman Jack Turner had been assigned to work alongside Corvin laborers in the deep extraction facilities. The Corvin were a species that had built their entire society around strict military hierarchies, where questioning orders was considered a sign of dangerous mental illness. Within 6 months of working with humans, Corvin workers had formed their first labor organization in their species' history. They were demanding safer working conditions, fair compensation, and the right to voice concerns without fear of punishment. The Corvin government was calling it a crisis that threatened their civilization's foundations. Rodriguez read reports describing how human concepts of individual worth and collective bargaining had spread through their worker population like an infectious disease. Corvin society was built on the principle that some beings were born to command, while others were born to obey. The humans hadn't tried to change this system, They had simply treated Corvan workers as equals and assumed they had the same rights as anyone else. Similar reports came from a dozen other worlds. On Xanthari colonies, human diplomats had accidentally started a movement among young Xanthari, who were questioning their species' rigid caste system. Xanthari society assigned roles at birth based on genetic markers, ensuring that each individual knew their place and purpose from their first day of life. Human diplomats had made the mistake of asking Xanthari workers about their dreams and ambitions, treating them as individuals rather than representatives of their assigned castes. The results had been catastrophic from the Xanthari leadership's perspective. Young Xanthari began refusing their assigned roles, demanding education opportunities outside their castes, and forming friendships across genetic boundaries that had been considered absolute for thousands of years. The Xanthari High Council was debating whether to classify exposure to human ideas as a form of mental contamination requiring quarantine and treatment. Rodriguez found himself reading incident report after incident report that painted the same picture. Humans weren't trying to disrupt alien societies, they were simply being themselves. They treated aliens as individuals rather than representatives of their species. They assumed that all sentient beings had inherent worth regardless of their social position. They offered friendship to anyone who seemed receptive, regardless of cultural barriers or historical animosities. To human thinking, these behaviors were natural expressions of basic decency and respect. To many alien civilizations, they were revolutionary concepts that threatened the very foundations of social order. The humans were catalysts for change not because they were trying to reform alien societies, but because their mere presence demonstrated that alternative ways of thinking and living were possible. The most disturbing discovery came when Rodriguez accessed classified council files that his security clearance barely allowed him to view. Several member species had been quietly developing contingency plans for what they called the human problem. Some plans involved economic isolation, cutting off trade and cultural exchange until humanity learned to conform to galactic norms. Others were more direct, involving the possibility of military action to quarantine Earth and prevent further human expansion into galactic civilization. But the most chilling documents Rodriguez found were research proposals submitted by several species scientific institutions. They wanted to study human psychology and behavior patterns to develop methods for containing or neutralizing what they saw as humanity's dangerous influence on established civilizations. They spoke of humans as if they were a plague that needed to be cured, rather than a species with a right to exist and grow. As Rodriguez compiled his evidence, he realized that the Galactic Council was facing the same choice that had apparently destroyed the Veiltar and countless other civilizations throughout galactic history. They could embrace the changes that contact with humanity would bring, accepting the disruption and uncertainty that came with growth and adaptation, or they could choose stability over progress, attempting to preserve their existing order by eliminating the catalyst that threatened to transform it. The prophecy had warned that this choice would determine not just humanity's fate, but the future of galactic civilization itself. The Galactic Council's decision to test humanity came disguised as a series of routine crisis response scenarios. Ambassador Zethkri presented the plan to the assembled delegates as an opportunity to evaluate human capabilities in real-world situations, but everyone in the chamber understood the true purpose. They were not testing human competence, they were testing human nature itself. Commander Sarah Blake received her orders while her relief squadron was stationed at the Outer Rim monitoring station near Xanthari space. The message seemed straightforward enough. Proceed immediately to Xanthari Prime, where an ecological crisis threatened the homeworld's delicate environmental balance. Industrial accidents had contaminated 3 major river systems, and the Xanthari government was requesting emergency assistance from any council member with relevant expertise. Sarah's team included some of the best environmental engineers and crisis specialists in the human fleet. Lieutenant Commander Rick Davis had spent 5 years developing water purification systems for colony worlds, while Dr. Kate Williams specialized in ecosystem restoration after industrial disasters. They approached the Xanthari crisis with the same methodical professionalism they brought to any emergency situation. What they found on Xanthari Prime shocked them more than the environmental damage itself. The Xanthari response to their own crisis was rigidly hierarchical and devastatingly inefficient. Each caste could only perform tasks specifically assigned to their genetic markers, which meant that brilliant engineers from lower castes were forbidden from contributing solutions, while less capable higher caste individuals struggled with problems beyond their expertise. Sarah watched in disbelief as Xanthari scientists from the engineer caste refused input from worker caste individuals who had intimate knowledge of the contaminated river systems. The workers had spent decades maintaining the industrial facilities and understood the contamination sources better than anyone. But social protocol required that they communicate only through multiple layers of intermediaries, each translation losing crucial technical details. "This is insane," Dr. Williams muttered during their third day on the planet. "We could solve this in half the time if they would just let their own people work together directly." Sarah made a decision that would later be analyzed by xenopolitical scholars as a perfect example of human instinctive behavior. She ignored Xanthari protocols and began organizing mixed caste work groups, treating all Xanthari volunteers as equals regardless of their genetic classifications. She assigned tasks based on individual knowledge and ability rather than social position, creating teams where engineer caste scientists worked directly alongside worker caste technicians and even some maintenance caste individuals whose practical experience proved invaluable. The results were immediate and dramatic. Projects that the Xanthari hierarchy estimated would take months were completed in weeks. Water purification systems that had been stalled by bureaucratic protocols came online within days. The contaminated rivers began showing signs of recovery faster than anyone had thought possible. But the real change happened in the Xanthari workers themselves. Young engineers who had never been allowed to question established procedures began proposing innovative solutions. Workers who had spent their lives following orders without explanation started asking why certain methods were used and suggesting improvements. Most shocking of all, members of different castes began forming genuine friendships, sharing meals and ideas in ways that violated thousands of years of social tradition. Across the galaxy, Lieutenant Mike Johnson's squadron was facing their own test scenario. Intelligence reports indicated that Corvan raiders were attacking neutral shipping in the Outer Rim territories, threatening trade routes that several council member species depended on for essential supplies. Johnson's orders were clear: locate and neutralize the threat using whatever means necessary. What Johnson found when he tracked down the raiders challenged every assumption he had about the situation. The Corvan attacking the trade ships were not career criminals or military renegades. They were desperate refugees from a mining colony that had been abandoned by their own government when the resources ran out. Corvan society provided no social safety net for citizens who could no longer contribute to the war economy, leaving thousands of families with no choice but to turn to piracy for survival. The standard military response would have been to destroy the raider ships and arrest any survivors for trial. Johnson chose a different approach. He opened communications with the Corvan leader, a former military officer named Growlthok, who had been reduced to piracy to feed his colony's children. "You're Corvan military," Johnson said during their first communication. "You know honor. What honor is there in attacking civilian ships?" Growlthok's response revealed the depth of his desperation. "There is no honor in watching children starve while the High Command pretends we never existed. We take only what we need to survive, and we harm no one who does not resist." Johnson spent 3 days negotiating with the raiders, learning their stories, and understanding their situation. Instead of fighting them, he worked with his crew to develop a solution that addressed the root cause of the problem. They helped the abandoned colonists establish contact with human refugee assistance programs and arranged for temporary settlement on a human colony world where their mining expertise would be valued. The Corvan raiders not only stopped their attacks on shipping, they became some of the most vocal advocates for human-style social safety net programs within Corvan space. Growlthok himself requested asylum rather than repatriation, claiming that exposure to human concepts of compassion and community responsibility had fundamentally changed his understanding of what civilization could be. Meanwhile, Dr. Katie Stevens was conducting linguistic research with the Mindari, the galaxy's only telepathic species. The Mindari had agreed to participate in what they believed was a routine cultural exchange program, but the Galactic Council was actually testing whether human emotional patterns could somehow influence or corrupt telepathic minds the Mindari had built their entire society around emotional control and mental barriers. They could read thoughts and feelings across species lines, but they had learned to maintain strict psychological distance to prevent emotional contamination. Their leaders feared that prolonged exposure to human minds might compromise their species' carefully maintained emotional stability. Dr. Stevens worked with a team of young Mindari researchers, sharing human literature, music, and art, while they studied human language patterns. What neither side expected was that the research would become a genuine collaborative friendship. Stevens found herself genuinely caring about her Mindari colleagues as individuals, worrying about their personal challenges and celebrating their successes. The Mindari researchers discovered that human emotional authenticity was unlike anything they had encountered. Most species thought in careful, controlled patterns that could be read and analyzed without affecting the telepathic observer. Human minds were chaotic storms of emotion, memory, and imagination that drew Mindari readers into genuine, empathetic connections. Young Mindari who worked with Stevens began experiencing emotions they had been taught to suppress. They felt joy in their work rather than just professional satisfaction. They worried about colleagues' well-being, rather than simply monitoring their efficiency. Most dangerously, they began to question whether their species' emotional isolation was really superior to the rich, complicated emotional lives they observed in humans. The Mindari leadership called an emergency session when they realized that their researchers were showing signs of what they classified as emotional contamination. The young Mindari were forming personal attachments, expressing individual preferences, and worst of all, questioning the wisdom of their elders' teachings about proper mental discipline. Each test scenario confirmed the Galactic Council's worst fears about human influence. Humans didn't conquer or destroy other civilizations, they inspired them to transform themselves. They treated every individual as having inherent worth regardless of social position, genetic markers, or species affiliation. They refused to accept that problems were unsolvable or that social systems couldn't be improved. Most terrifying of all, their influence seemed to be contagious. Aliens who worked alongside humans began adopting human attitudes and behaviors, questioning established traditions and forming connections across barriers that had seemed absolute for millennia. The test results painted a clear picture. Humanity was exactly what the Veiltar prophecy had warned about. A catalyst species whose very existence would force the galaxy to choose between growth and stagnation, between transformation and destruction. Admiral Tony Garcia received the emergency transmission from Earth Fleet Command, while his ships were conducting routine patrol exercises near the border of Council space. The message was brief, but carried the weight of Earth's entire future. Proceed immediately to the Galactic Council chambers with the full diplomatic fleet. Humanity's fate was about to be decided in a final vote that could determine whether humans would be welcomed as full members of galactic civilization or quarantined on Earth forever. Garcia's fleet consisted of 12 ships representing the best of human engineering and design philosophy. Unlike the imposing warships favored by species like the Corvan Empire, or the sleek vessels that reflected Xanthari aesthetic principles, human ships looked practical and lived in, designed by people who valued function over intimidation and comfort over status display. As they approached the council station, Garcia wondered if their appearance would work for or against them in the coming negotiations. Captain Alex Rodriguez had spent the previous week working with Professor Amy Watson and Dr. Ben Carter to decode the complete Veiltar prophecy. The crystal from Kepler 442b had contained far more information than the initial message, hidden in layers of data that required human intuition and alien analytical methods working together to unlock. What they discovered changed everything they thought they knew about the choice facing the galaxy. The complete prophecy revealed that the Veiltar had faced exactly the same situation 3 million years ago when they encountered their own catalyst species, beings they called the Seekers. The Seekers had possessed the same traits that now characterized humanity: an refusal to accept limitations, a tendency to form bonds across species barriers, and a dangerous habit of treating all individuals as equals regardless of their origins or status. Rodriguez stood before the assembled council delegates as he prepared to present their findings. The chamber was more crowded than he had ever seen it, with representatives from species that rarely participated in council affairs, making the journey to witness what many believed would be a historic decision. The tension in the air was so thick it seemed to affect even the translation systems, which struggled to convert the emotional undertones of various alien languages. 3 million years ago, the Veiltar faced the same choice you face today, Rodriguez began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. They encountered a species that challenged their understanding of civilization and progress. The Seekers brought new ideas about individual worth, social flexibility, and the possibility that established systems could be improved rather than simply maintained. He activated the holographic display system, showing images from the newly decoded sections of the Veiltar crystal. The projections revealed a civilization at the height of its power, controlling thousands of star systems and possessing technology that seemed almost magical by current standards. But beneath the surface grandeur, the records revealed a society that had become rigidly stratified and resistant to change. The Veiltar chose stability over growth, Rodriguez continued. They quarantined the Seekers on their homeworld, limiting their contact with Veiltar citizens to prevent the spread of what they considered dangerous ideas. They maintained their perfect order, their unchanging social systems, their predictable patterns of life and governance. The alien delegates listened with growing unease as Rodriguez described what had happened next. The Veiltar had achieved their goal of preserving their civilization unchanged, but the galaxy around them had continued to evolve. New challenges arose that required adaptation and innovation, problems that could only be solved by thinking in ways the Veiltar had trained themselves to avoid. When crisis finally came, they were too rigid to bend and too proud to learn from the species they had rejected. The Seekers survived, Rodriguez said quietly. Their homeworld endured long after the last Veiltar colony fell silent. Because when change came, they were ready to grow and adapt while the Veiltar could only repeat the same failed responses their ancestors had used for millennia. Ambassador Zethkree rose to speak, his forearms trembling with barely controlled emotion. You ask us to risk everything our civilizations have built on the possibility that change will be beneficial rather than destructive. How can we trust that humanity will not lead us to the same chaos that destroyed so many species throughout galactic history? Admiral Garcia stepped forward to answer, his military bearing commanding attention from even the most hostile delegates. Because we're not asking you to trust us, he said simply. We're asking you to trust yourselves, to believe that your civilizations are strong enough to grow rather than just survive, wise enough to learn rather than just repeat, and brave enough to choose hope over fear. The debate that followed lasted for 18 hours, with delegates arguing passionately for both positions. Those who favored containment pointed to the test results showing how human influence had disrupted established social systems across multiple worlds. They argued that accepting humanity as full council members would inevitably lead to the collapse of galactic civilization as they knew it. Those who supported integration acknowledged the risks but pointed to the benefits that human participation had already brought to the galaxy. Medical advances, technological innovations, and artistic collaborations that had enriched the lives of billions of beings across dozens of worlds. The turning point came when the youngest member of the council requested permission to speak. The Nalari delegate was barely 30 years old by her species standards, representing a civilization that had only joined the council 50 years earlier. Her words carried the perspective of someone who had grown up seeing humans as simply another member, species rather than as a threat to established order. I have studied the histories of every species in this chamber, she said, her voice clear and confident despite her youth. Every one of our civilizations reached a point where they had to choose between remaining the same forever or risking change to become something better. The species that chose growth and adaptation became the civilizations we celebrate today. The species that chose perfect stability became footnotes in our historical archives. She gestured toward the empty seats that represented extinct council members, civilizations that had once seemed permanent and unshakable. The universe does not stop changing because we wish it would. We can choose to change with it, guided by our own wisdom and values, or we can choose to resist until change is forced upon us by circumstances beyond our control. The final vote was closer than anyone had expected. 7 species voted for full human integration into galactic civilization, 4 voted for quarantine and isolation, and 1 abstained. The narrow margin reflected how deeply the decision had divided the council, but it was enough to grant humanity full membership status and the rights that came with it. But the real transformation had already begun during the debate itself. The process of deciding humanity's fate had forced every council member to examine their own assumptions about civilization, progress, and the nature of intelligent life. Species that had not questioned their social systems for centuries found themselves debating whether their traditional ways were truly the best possible approaches. The ceremony that officially welcomed humanity into the Galactic Council was deliberately simple, but it marked the beginning of an unprecedented era in galactic history. For the first time, the Council included a species that treated social transformation as natural and beneficial rather than dangerous and threatening. Rodriguez stood with his fellow human delegates as they took their official seats in the council chamber, surrounded by beings who had chosen to trust in the possibility of positive change. The ancient Veiltar prophecy had been fulfilled, not through conquest or destruction, but through the most fundamentally human belief of all, that tomorrow could be better than today if people were willing to work together to make it so. The galaxy had chosen hope over fear, growth over stagnation, and the uncertain promise of a better future over the false security of an unchanging past. The real test would be whether they could build that better future together. But for the first time in millions of years, an entire galaxy was willing to try.